Has Chris Jericho confirmed his return to WWE? The real reason Ric Flair wasn't on last night's Dynamite, my review of AEW's Blood and Guts show, and more. I'm Luke Owen and this is the WrestleTalk News.
Support WrestleTalk!
Give us a subscribe.
I am continually impressed with people who overcome and beat their addictions and demons. It's an insanely tough road, and it should be celebrated whenever possible. So I wanted to use this platform to give some props to TNA champion Mike Santana, who announced on Twitter yesterday that he is now 1,000 days clean and sober. He posted, "Very proud of this milestone. Blessed with what I've been able to accomplish during this time, both personally and professionally. Living proof of what happens when you put in the work. I'd be lying if I told you that every day was easy. Life is going to do what life does, but I'm thankful to have a set of tools to help me maneuver through the bad as well as the good." Wrestling fandom can be horribly toxic at times, so I encourage you to leave your comments today shouting out Mike Santana and his accomplishment. And if you have a similar tale, if you're 10,000 days in, or if you're just starting your journey, tell your story in the comments. Support WrestleTalk, support each other. And it's awkward now because I have to slide into a story that might actually bring out some of that toxic wrestling fandom. Chris Jericho was one of AEW's first signings. He is inarguably the biggest signing of the first couple of months of the company's existence. In their recently released book that tells the story of the first 5 years of AEW, which I have now read and think is a broadly fine puff piece, several AEW stars note the importance of Jericho's signing for All Elite Wrestling. He was their first world champion, the top heel, as he led the Inner Circle. He formed several other factions after that, including the Jericho Appreciation Society and Learning Tree, and he feuded with names like Orange Cassidy, MJF, Hook, and more in an effort to raise the profiles and put over the younger and less well-known names. He was squashed by Powerhouse Hobbs. He lost to Action Andretti. And some of those feuds landed and others didn't, but for the most part, the guys Jericho faced never really got anything out of the feuds. Part of that is on AEW's creative failing to follow through on Jericho's losses, but fans have noted that there isn't any smoke without fire, and if multiple people don't come out of Jericho feuds with any stock raised, then perhaps some of the fault does lie at the feet of Chris Jericho. Hulk Hogan claims he put over Billy Kidman. Triple H says he put over the Brooklyn Brawler. You might have put them over, but you didn't get them over. That's the difference. This is a criticism levied against Jericho by a large portion of AEW fans. To his credit, Jericho lent into the negative sentiment from the online audience. The Learning Tree faction was a direct parody of the criticisms. People complained about Chris Jericho taking too much TV time from younger stars, so he had a segment called TV Time with Chris Jericho. But 2025 has been a big year of fan speculation that Jericho could have his eye on the door out of AEW to a different door back to WWE, the company he left nearly a decade ago. He's not been on AEW TV since April when he lost the ROH Championship to Bandido. There's been no report of creative plans for him to come back. He's gotten into WWE shape. He's been publicly liking tweets that say he should go back to WWE, and now he's done a podcast. On the latest episode of Talk is Jericho, I know I'm as surprised as you are that podcast is still going, Y2J had on the Hardys and the Dudley Boys to break down their final match together that took place at TNA's Bound for Glory. But the big talking point of the podcast comes about 7 minutes in when they're talking about the size of the crowd. On that show, TNA announced that they'd broken their attendance record with 7,794, which is a massive achievement. However, WrestleNomics recently revealed that TNA actually sold around 5,500 tickets and the turnstile count was just over 6,000. A wrestling company artificially inflating their attendance figures. Next you'll be telling me that water is wet. But whatever the actual figure is, you cannot deny that TNA has seen a big bump in their attendance for their big shows, and a huge part of that has to be attributed to their working relationship and partnership with WWE. As I said on yesterday's WrestleTalk News, I think the brand name TNA has not been this valuable since before Hogan and Eric Bischoff killed it between 2010 and 2013. And speaking of that crowd, Chris Jericho said that crowd looked huge. It was like a WWE level crowd. A fair statement to make. Perhaps a little bit hyperbolic, but mostly fair. However, it's the next bit that has got fans talking, as he added, "I was watching this and compared it to watching Dynamite when they were at the ECW arena, which looked like a Tony Condello taping. Sorry, it did. TNA looked like the second biggest company in the world. Yes, I also had to Google that reference for the record. Tony Condella was a Canadian wrestling promoter in the 1980s. This is a line from his Wikipedia entry about his death tours in Manitoba. The tour is well known for its rough conditions. Wrestlers were required to pack at least one bag of food to last them the entire tour. There was also no hotel accommodations, with wrestlers having to either sleep in cars or on the side of the road or at the venues they perform. Tell me you're going back to WWE without saying you're going back to WWE. All kidding aside, publicly burying the promotion you work for and putting over the WWE indoor show is perhaps the biggest sign that Chris Jericho is done with All Elite Wrestling and will be returning to WWE when his contract expires at the end of the year. But what do you think? Do you want to see Jericho return to WWE? Would you like him to stay in AEW? Fire off your thoughts in the comments. A quick bit of news from last night's AEW Dynamite, which I will be reviewing shortly, and it was advertised ahead of time that Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Ric Flair would be on the show, a show that took place in Greensboro, North Carolina, an NWA and WCW hotbed. Steamboat was on the show and did an in-ring segment with FTR where he cleared house alongside the tag champs Bro Dido. But despite dropping his name several times in the promo, there was no Ric Flair on this show. Dave Meltzer is now reporting that Flair was at the show and appeared in front of the live crowd, but he left shortly afterwards, telling people that he was in a ton of pain following a recent rotator cuff tear. Meltzer adds that AEW had to change the show around as Flair was planned to be part of that FTR segment, which then had to be altered. But it's Thursday, you know what that means. It's time for my review of AEW Dynamite Blood and Guts 2025. Back in 2009, when WWE were panicking because pay-per-view buys were on the decline, they came up with a concept to entice people back: the gimmick pay-per-view. This, of course, worked to great success with the Royal Rumble and Survivor Series and eventually Money in the Bank, but the same cannot be said for Breaking Point or Fatal 4-Way. And perhaps the most famous of these gimmick pay-per-views was Hell in a Cell, a show that took what felt like the most protected match stipulation in WWE and oversaturated it to the point that it meant nothing anymore. One of the best things Triple H has done since getting the creative book in WWE is making Hell in a Cell mean like it's worth a damn again. I bring this up because one of the reasons fans complained about the Hell in a Cell gimmick pay-per-view was having 2 to 3 Hell in a Cells on the show was overkill. The same criticism has been levied against Triple H's Survivor Series, which has 2 War Games matches. And I get that, and I actually felt it here on this episode of Dynamite, as it took me a little while to get into the men's Blood and Guts, which main evented the show, as I was burned out on the gimmick after the women's Blood and Guts that opened the show. What I do think AEW did well though was use the matches to serve different masters. The men's match was more about story and character. It had its fair share of violence and wild spots, but the match was built around Moxley's Death Riders faction falling apart at the seams and his ability to lead the group coming into question, which meant that the women's match could just focus on the violence, chaos, and utter madness. There were character beats in there that built several different feuds in the world and tag title scenes, but front and center was the spectacle and brutality, and I loved it. This could be recency bias, I'm not sure, but this might be my favorite Blood and Guts match that AEW have ever done. Sky Blue and Willow Nightingale started with Sky getting busted open something fierce in the first 5 minutes. Julia Hart and Harley Cameron, dressed as Tifa from Final Fantasy VII, were in next, followed by Tekla and Jamie Hayter, who brought in a bag of tacks that seemingly exploded because they just went everywhere. Megan Bayne came in to brilliantly no-sell some of this craziness, followed by Chris Statlander and her full-gear challenger Mercedes Moné, who handed several of her world titles to her teammates to use as weapons. Chekhov's weapons will come into the finish. Mina Shirakawa came in with a barbed wire baseball bat, followed by Marina Shafir, who kicked Statlander into a bed of nails. And finally, Toni Storm came in to use a pearl necklace as a weapon. I get it, it's a cum joke. We were well over 30 minutes into the match before it actually got started, and it just got bonkers from there. I think AEW got their tables this week from the Chuck Norris hardware store, as nothing would break them. That's a joke for my fellow elder millennials who were there for the golden age of the internet. And Cameron got one of the bigger pops of the match when she brought out the Mercedes Moné puppet, only to reveal she had brass knucks underneath. Well, she was dressed as Tifa after all. Hart and Tekla somehow snaked through like the cage bits, the sort of the joining bits of the structure that led to a brawl on the outside, and saw Statlander give Mercedes Moné a Samoan drop off the side of the cage through a table that had the rest of her world titles on it. The finish saw Marina trapped Mina in a chokehold while Bane whipped her with a title belt while the Triangle of Madness hauled Toni back and forced her to watch. Toni submitted to save her friends, neatly building their tag title tournament match against Bane and Shafir. I adored this so much. The Don Callis family attacked Jurassic Express to show the Bucks just what can happen when they work together, and they promise they'll do the same to Kenny Omega next week. Hangman Page beat Powerhouse Hobbs in a fun Falls Count Anywhere match. Lads, you've literally got 2 rings. We didn't need crowd brawling as well. And the finish saw Page knock Hobbs off the stand through a production table that made the lights in the building flicker. It was the right side of goofy. Joe and Shibata attacked afterwards, and Hook and Kingston made the save as Joe lowered the cage. Page then told Joe that if he wanted a cage match, all he had to do was ask, which neatly ties into how this feud first started. Ricky Steamboat then came out for that promo segment where he put over Greensboro and its history, and FTR came out for the usual heel shenanigans. They stopped Steamboat leaving and attacked him before Brodito ran out for the save. And the main event was the men's Blood and Guts match where the babyfaces had the advantage. Now, traditionally, the heels have the advantage in war games. It's the best way to tell a story. It's the best way to structure the match. But I think here it worked, mostly because the faces got the advantage due to Mox getting counted out against Roderick Strong, continuing the story of his decline, and they did a deal where Mark Briscoe was taken out backstage and unable to compete, meaning the heels did really have the advantage. But the bigger story of the match was Moxley. Throughout the match, Bryan Danielson, his former teammate, brought up his bad strategic moves, having Yuta and Garcia out first, not utilizing Claudio, and Mox coming out 4th instead of 5th, which Excalibur said he thinks Mox did because that is when the Death Riders had the upper hand, so he shifted around his order. Yuta and Darby started the match, of course Darby started, and they were joined by Orange Cassidy and Daniel Garcia, and then we got the reveal that Mark Briscoe had been taken out by the Don Callis family backstage. Claudio was in next, followed by Kyle O'Reilly, Moxley, Roderick Strong, and then finally, Pac. Mark Briscoe then came down to the ring against Doctor's orders, which led to him giving Yuta the J-Driller onto some chairs on top of the cage. Gabe Kidd then appeared from nowhere to take out Darby, and he and Pac ended sending Allen off the entrance tunnels through a flaming table. And just when it looked like the Death Riders had it all sewn up, the good guys fired back, and Kyle O'Reilly forced Moxley to tap out with the ankle lock as he writhed through broken glass. It was a fantastic ending visual, and it capped off a really good match that got great once everyone was in. With only 3 matches, Dynamite needed this 2.5 hours to deliver, and I think it actually over-delivered. Both the cage matches brought something different whilst also giving you the violence that you want, a smashing success. But what is going on with WWE and TKO's Mark Shapiro saying that they want to move away from Vince McMahon era PLEs? Find out more in yesterday's WrestleTalk news.